Hello and welcome. Today is Wednesday, January 8th, 2020. This is the first meeting of the Cluster API office hours for 2020. This is a sub-project of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We also have meeting etiquette, and this meeting is being recorded. So if you do want to say something, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom, and I will make sure to pay attention. And if you haven't already done so, please add your name to the attending list in the agenda document. And if you have anything that you would like to discuss, feel free to add it into the agenda. And first up, something we started doing recently is if there's anybody who is new and would like to introduce themselves, please feel free. There's no obligation, so if you aren't comfortable doing that, that's perfectly fine. But if there's anybody, feel free to say hi. Okay. Moving on straight through to the demos and POCs. Andrew, you've got a demo for us today. So
yeah,
sharing.
Thank you. So I don't know how much of a, I should have practiced before I started this. So everyone knows about the machine load balancer KEP that people have been working on. I assume, right? That Moshe has been working on, the idea that it would be great to have a generic machine load balancer for deploying load balancers of different types, whether it's NSX on VMware, F5, NetScaler, whatever. And so I'm sure in the issues in CAPI, y'all have seen me crop up several times relating to HA and CAPV. Right? VMware does not have a built-in solution for providing an external control plane endpoint to clusters. So I've been heavily involved in or pushing for having this load balancer model. So recently, before and a little near Christmas, I started working on this, and we actually merged an initial implementation of this into CAPV last week, or I guess, yeah, Monday. So CAPV now has HA, and I thought I'd kind of review how it was implemented in CAPV to hopefully show the way this load balancer model could work on at a broader scale in CAPI for other providers as well. So what I guess the easiest thing to do would just kind of be able to go over the CRDs real quick. All we did was introduce a new field into our infrastructure cluster called load balancer ref. All right, this load balancer ref, or the load balancer ref, points to, at this time, an HA proxy load balancer. The HA proxy load balancer CRD and the vSphere, or the infrastructure CRDs, that's vSphere cluster and vSphere machine, have no relationship to one another other than this load balancer ref. And I'm about to make myself a liar, just so you're aware. If you do go look at the code, the vSphere cluster controller, the vSphere cluster controller does currently watch HA proxy load balancer, mainly because I didn't feel like implementing the generic external watchers that CAPI did using the infrastructure ref. But there's a single type right now, and we'll be planning to introduce NSX soon, and then we'll introduce the external watchers the way CAPI does. But other than that, there's no relationship. And so, well, how does that actually work? Well, everyone knows in CAPI when you do a cluster reconcile, right, or from an infrastructure provider, you don't mark yourself as ready until you're infrastructure ready. I always have thought that's a little confusing, because from a infrastructure provider point of view, ready just means you're ready. It doesn't necessarily mean infrastructure ready, because it's not called infrastructure ready. But in upstream CAPI, the field they copy is called infrastructure ready. Up until I introduced this was always true. Like we added the finalizer true, because we're always ready. We had no infrastructure. However, now, if we have a load balancer ref using an unstructured reader, we do a couple of things. The first thing we do, and this will be something like a generic load balancer controller will do in the future, hopefully, is it sets the owner of the load balancer back to the CAPI cluster. And again, that should probably be something a generic load balancer controller does that lives in CAPI, or maybe I'll move it to another controller here. But it just does it here because it was easy to do, because I have to read the data anyway. So it sets the owner, and that's to ensure that the load balancer gets deleted after the CAPI cluster, gets garbage collected after the CAPI cluster, okay? And then the next thing it does, it just, again, uses unstructured reader to check to see if the load balancer object is status ready and has a status. And so that's sort of the only runtime requirement for that load balancer ref. You need to have a status ready that's a bool and a status address that's a string. And that status address is used as our control plane endpoint. And if somebody has set a port on our spec, we will use it. Otherwise, we have a default API endpoint of 6443. And we log, hey, control plane endpoint discovered via load balancer. So again, we're no longer ready. If there's a load balancer ref set, we're no longer ready until this load balancer has provided us an address. And so how does that, with something like HA proxy load balancer, how does it actually do the load balancing? Well, it's a pretty basic type. Now, I say there's no relationship. Now, the first thing I said, I'm going to make a liar to myself. And here you think I'm going to make a liar to myself again. I'm not. In the process of creating this, I also created a new CRD in CAPV called vSphere VM. It has no relationship to CAPI. This is just used to deploy a virtual machine. And it was because I didn't feel like rewriting or refactoring a bunch of the code I had that deployed VMs that was related to CAPI. Like, it would literally look into a CAPI machine for things like the name. I didn't feel like refactoring all of that or copying all of that, doing a copy pasta. So I was like, okay, well, I'll just turn that into a generic provisioner. So it has a clone spec because the HA proxy load balancer is deployed using an OVA on your vCenter. And this is Chuck. This should look familiar to you. This is kind of like the cloud init data, the bootstrap data, and the kubeadm config. This is if you want an optional SSH user to SSH into the load balancer, you can. Otherwise, whatever. And again, our status. And you can see that I mark it as this field. Both of these fields are required as part of the portable load balancer model, and it's inspected. So people know that it's optional, but it's really required at runtime. Okay. So what actually happens? How does this work? Well, all of us should look very familiar. You know, we reconcile it. Oh, what does it watch? So it watches vSphere VM because that's how it gets deployed. Again, not related to CAPI. It watches a CAPI machine using this control plane machine to HA proxy load balancer function. And I documented what it does here. Basically, it says, hey, anytime a CAPI machine is reconciled, if it's a control plane machine and it has an address, and I can get the cluster, and that cluster has an infrastructure ref, and that infrastructure ref has a ref, and that load balancer ref points to me or something of my type, I should reconcile myself. I should be reconciled. So in effect, it's saying reconcile me whenever any of the CAPI machines that belong to the same cluster that owns me get reconciled. Any of the control plane machines. Okay. Get owner cluster. Okay. Delete. I'll go over delete last. So all basic stuff. So the HA proxy load balancer itself has a couple of secrets. Has a secret for its certificate, bootstrap data, also its config. This just stands up the OVA. And then finally, I mean, this is all just HA proxy specific stuff, right? Create config secret, reconcile load balancer config. Here's the thing that the other load balancers might also need to do, right? Reconcile backend servers. Get all the CAPI machine resources for this cluster. So this is the part that may be able to be made generic. You know, get the control plane machines, and then this is HA proxy specific, add to the backend load balancer. And so finally, when all that's done, right, it marks itself as ready and it has an address. And it's like, cool, okay, now the vSphere cluster can say, all right, well, I've got a load balancer. I've got the address. And I'm going to set that as my control plane endpoint. And guess what? Hey, everybody, so CAPI can go do its thing. And this gives us the ability to deploy HA clusters with CAPV in a way that doesn't tie the HA proxy implementation to CAPV. It ties it to vSphere in a way because we're deploying this as an OVA, right? But you could easily see how the NetScaler or F5 implementation doesn't actually need to deploy a VM to get a load balancer. Those would already exist. So their own controller would be drastically simpler. It would just be, well, where's my config so I know how to talk to the NetScaler, and then it would be reconcile my backend servers. But what's generic is that reconcile backend servers, as well as I need to watch all of the control plane machines. And I mean, I could run through what it looks like, but it's just going to take a couple of minutes. I think it's kind of more important to review how it was implemented here, because again, aside from that watch, everything is done with an unstructured reader, and the HA proxy load balancer, CRD, has zero relationship to vSphere cluster or vSphere machine, right? The only relationship it has is this load balancer ref. So you can easily see how anything else could drop in there. And again, Yassine and I talked about it, like the vSphere cluster controller is currently responsible for setting the owner on the load balancer. But again, that would be a generic load balancer in the load balancer controller in the future. And I only aped it here because I had to get that object anyway because I had to read the status. But I hope this is kind of evidence to how this could be made generic and it's implemented in a generic and portable way so that other people could easily slot load balancers in that, again, only know about CAPI machines, right? There's nothing in the HA proxy load balancer that knows anything about CAPV. So yeah, any questions? If there are any questions, I guess I'll show this real quick, what that actually looks like in a test. That infrastructure, that the cluster spec load balancer ref, I mean, it's literally like, just like it would be from the CAPI cluster with an infrastructure ref. And again, like this would be like that load balancer controller, maybe a generic load balancer type. You could see how that might sit inside of the CAPI contrib directory. Okay, well, thanks, Tim. But I mean, Moshe has done the lion's share of the design here. I pretty much stole everything from him, and honestly, from the great design of CAPI, the whole notion of just the ref, the control plane machine to the load balancer function was fun. Anyway, but yeah, so hopefully this will allow others to kind of see how this is done in actual action, and maybe start developing their own. But it would be great to kind of move some of the stuff into CAPI itself, at least like the some of the more generic actions, like the load balance, like setting the owner on the load balancer. And the one other interesting thing, I suppose, like for Andy, we assert that all HA proxy load balancer resources to this are removed. But of course, that happens after we delete the cluster. And as part of this, you saw the vSphere VM CRD. One of the other things I did was I refactored the deletion logic to be more like CAPI. So we don't do controller owner references anymore. We just do owner references. And when we delete anything, I said I would show the delete. It's going to look very familiar to you because we do something very similar where we say, okay, can we get it? Does it have a timestamp? Delete. But again, after the cluster is deleted, our tests still take like another 20 seconds because now we have to wait for the load balancer to be garbage collected. If the load balancer ref or the notion of it exists in an upstream CAPI, that could be part or the last thing that y'all do, and we wouldn't have to wait for garbage collection. Anyway, that's it. Any questions?
See, Michael, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, it looks like this load balancer ref is on the cluster object. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. It's on the vSphere cluster, the infrastructure cluster.
So it's provider specific object?
No, sir. The HA proxy load balancer doesn't actually know about the vSphere machine. It when it does anything, it works with CAPI machines. But remember, like I didn't modify CAPI. I don't have a local. I do have a local fork of CAPI, but I didn't want to go modify the CAPI cluster. We actually needed this, so I couldn't necessarily wait for CAPI to have something like this upstream. So instead, I put the ref on the infrastructure cluster. But yeah, you could have a reference like this on the CAPI
I
cluster itself.
see. Yeah, yeah, that's what I'm getting at. I see it's on the vSphere cluster as opposed to just a whatever we're calling it, neutral cluster.
Well, the CAPI cluster, right? But I didn't want to just build CAPV with a outstanding fork of CAPI with this.
Yeah,
Maybe this
so,
goes upstream, or maybe it never does. But
yeah, V1 Alpha 3 is big enough. And so what we asked Andrew and Yassine and Moshe to look into was doing this for the vSphere provider for right now. And then the long-term intent would be to learn how things went with this vSphere specific implementation, and then ultimately, ideally, adapt it and move it into Cluster API proper.
And what is the mechanism for assigning particular machines to a particular load balancer?
so the HA proxy load balancer, anyway, it gets deployed every time you deploy a new vSphere, a new cluster with CAPV. It's a 200-ish meg OVA, and it uses link mode, so it deploys in seconds. So for every vSphere cluster, you would have a very small VM out there that provides a load balancer. But regardless, the actual implementation of how what the question you just asked, um, it looks to say, okay, well, I know the CAPI cluster owns me. So in fact, if you look up here, it will, under its reconcile, it won't go any further until an owner ref has been set on it that points back to a CAPI cluster. Okay, so it's owned by a CAPI cluster. And when it wants to discover what it should assign to its virtual server or its load balancer, right? It says, give me all of the CAPI machine resources for this cluster, and then filter those into the control plane machines. So this would be, you could consider this implementation specific, but I think this is fairly generic, right?
No, I don't think so. Like
Okay.
in our setup, we have the routers on workers, and those are the things that need to be added to load balancers.
Your control plane machines aren't your control plane machines?
No, we have routers, for ingress, network ingress.
Okay.
And those
This is just a control plane load balancer. This isn't for any other type of load balancing.
Yeah, that's kind of what my takeaway was. And I was hoping for something more generic where you could just prescribe, I want some kind of load balancer, and then I want to add whatever machines to the load balancer. And this seems to be very much more tightly coupled into various layers of the stack rather than being like its own portable thing.
Well, it's a machine load balancer kit. It's for load balancing the, what did I do? Did I introduce a bug? Damn it. This always happens. There's a GCR issue. That's not my issue. There's a GCR issue. That's interesting. Yeah. So I encourage you to take that up with the CAP.
Yeah, so the proposal is for a generic machine-based load balancer that uses a label selector to select machines.
Mm-hmm.
And
I didn't implement the label selector. I kind of hard-coded that to be just control plane machines. I skipped that. I didn't in this case, Andy. So
yeah.
But you're right. That is what the KEP says.
Yeah, I would be concerned. Yeah, the tight coupling with the control plane we're talking about. If this load balancer exists, the thing's not going ready to the load balancer and building all this other logic into these other pieces. And it just seems like I'm not sure that, seems kind of intertwined. And I think like it just seems like you just say, hey, I want a load balancer, it gives you a load balancer. And then when the load balancer is done, it goes on to the next step. And later it does those label selectors to add machines or whatever. It really I don't see like the need for all that intertwinement there.
Yeah, so this is a proof of concept, and it will evolve over time. We do have a couple of
Absolutely.
Moshe and then Yassine.
Yeah, so thanks, Andrew. This is a really good start, and I think it's very well done. So I do have some comments, but I think we should rather move those offline. So the question is, should we create an issue in CAPV for some of these comments, or put them in a separate cap? That's on the one part, and then the second part is there was some discussion about a contrib directory in CAPI proper. So I'm going to start working on the NSXT load balancer, and I'm not sure if you mentioned something about NSXT, so I'd like to know where you guys are on that, particularly.
Yeah. Yeah, Yassine has been looking into that as well. So maybe you two could sync offline. We have a need for that. So yeah, let's sync offline on that. I want to circle back to the comments. I would say let's focus on the KEP. That we have, at VMware we have some product needs around the load balancer, and so this will be what it is for now for CAPV. But I think everything should be driven through the KEP, and then we could update this as we go along, and maybe this stays a POC for your KEP. Maybe something else becomes the POC. But we could chat offline. I mean, for all warning, like I didn't check with Moshe before I implemented this. I just called it a POC of his KEP because it was based on it, but he didn't agree to that. So, I mean, this shouldn't be representative of anything Moshe decided. And so we could talk in the future about whether we want this to actually be that, Moshe.
Cool. So, and then the next part was, what are we going to kind of do with the contrib in CAPI proper? Are we still planning on putting something there, or should we move efforts to this POC? I'm happy to build upon this POC and move it upstream to CAPI proper at a later date. I just yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, that's not on me.
Yeah, I was going to say I'll talk to Tim, but I see Tim saying let's evaluate for Alpha 4. So I would say, for Alpha 3, over the next couple of months, whatever code y'all are working on can either live in CAPV, or we can create a contrib directory in Cluster API, and you can go wild in there. And then we can evaluate the proposal and official implementation, at least of the machine load balancer generic controller for Alpha 4.
Just FYI, I did create a contrib directory inside of CAPV if we want to put anything there, because I had to create open API bindings for HA Proxy's data plane. I actually didn't want to use HA Proxy as of a month ago, but I found out I thought it was jank because I thought I was going to have to do everything via SSH. But they have this brand new data plane API server, and I've been working with their engineers on improving it. We just finished a PR for mutual cert auth that doesn't require basic as well. So they're doing a lot of work to help us out as well. Give them credit.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, and everybody else who's been involved.
Thank you. Yep. And by the way, if you see, it is deploying a 2-node cluster. So CAPV has HA. It's a long time coming. All right. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Give me just a minute to get my setup back so I can see when people are raising hands. All righty. We have a discussion topic about Tilt Cluster API performance preloading images. I don't know who wrote this, so Maya, is that you? Thought I heard somebody chime in.
Get the audio out of that.
All right. Hello.
There we go. Can hear you now.
God. I
Yeah, we
can't tell
can
if
hear
my
you.
audio is coming through. Who knows? Who can say? All right. Oh shoot.
They can hear you.
We can hear you.
Yeah. Can we turn the speakers back on with that?
I think it's gonna have lots of feedback.
Oh God. All right. I think I think my audio is trying to come out through my microphone, so let me just fix that.
All right.
Sure. Great. Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Or can you still hear me, I guess? Sorry about that, folks. Hey, so this is Maya from Tilt, the dev tool that at least some of you have been using to develop Cluster API, which is super cool. And I've got Nick and Dan here also, who you can't see, but I promise they're here. And we wanted to ask you all some questions about whether and how you folks have been using Tilt to develop on Cluster API and where we can help with performance and dev experience.
That sounds great. Please go ahead.
Is there, just in case anyone in this chat doesn't know who we are and what we do, Tilt is a microservice dev tool. The idea is that we run all of your Kubernetes stuff and all of your services. So you can configure everything in one place. You can run everything with a single command. You get all of your logs in one place. So you can tell when things are going wrong. And any changes you make to your files get really quickly propagated into your running containers. You don't need to wait a million years for things to build, that sort of thing. And I understand that, like, I've seen that Cluster API already has a Tilt file, which is super cool. So who here uses Tilt for developing on Cluster API?
I'd say a good number of us do. So Chuck Ha did the first bit of work a few months ago to get us started with Tilt. And then I recently got the Tilt file put in place and did the support so that we have a couple federated repositories. So we have a core Cluster API GitHub repository, and then we have individual provider repositories. And I wanted to have a way so that we could just have a single Tilt file that spun everything up together, even though not everything was in the same GitHub repository. And so I think I was chatting with you about that, Maya, on Slack the other day also.
Yeah. How do you feel about the multi-repo single Tilt file structure? Is that feeling okay? Is it, do you wish it were different? Are there pain points there?
Personally, I think it's great, and I don't have any problems with it. But Chuck or anybody else who's been working with Tilt over the past couple of weeks, feel free to chime in too, please.
Yeah, I think the way that Andy set it up is pretty cool. I haven't had time to play with it yet because I've been doing a bunch of non-Tilt related work, but I'm looking forward to using it more regularly to have better feedback. I just haven't had a chance to play with it too much yet.
Cool, yeah. So I noticed your Tilt file is pretty kind specific, and I'm wondering what that thought process was like, how opinionated you folks are about everyone who uses Tilt to develop CAPI should use kind, or if there were folks who were interested in using other clusters to develop, just because there's a lot of kind related overhead in your Tilt file, and one solution to some of that would be just use a cluster that's less of a pain. So curious about your thoughts there.
Yeah, so Andrew, I saw your hand went up. Was that for?
Oh, she went down a different topic, so I just decided to lower it and let this topic go first.
Okay.
Cool. If you talk about that later, you're welcome to shoot us an email or a Slack if we don't get back to it.
There's not, I wouldn't say there's actually all that much that's kind specific. Like there's some stuff about getting it getting the cert manager images preloaded. And I know Nadir, I'm gonna let you speak because I know you're not using kind. So Well, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I actually have a local cluster that I use, maybe because I have some other bits and pieces in there, like Locky for logs, and so I can search on them in Grafana. So we've actually made the kind specific stuff conditional, so you can opt out of it. So it opted into kind by default, and then you can set, you can say I don't want the image preloading stuff, and that more or less works with my cluster. I haven't had any issues with it.
Oh, I see. There's a preload images for kind Boolean. Nicely done. I didn't even catch that. Cool. That's very exciting, and I'm glad that has been mostly working for you.
Chuck, you've got your hand up too.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious, are there other Kubernetes clusters that you would recommend or suggest using in place of kind?
I mean, normally, like we often recommend Docker for desktop, but I just tried to build Cappy on Docker for desktop, and I felt like my laptop was gonna blast off. So, but maybe a remote cluster like GKE, it'll be like the initial pushes will be a bit of overhead because you need to like push stuff to a Docker registry, but after that, the live updating is pretty fast, and so it shouldn't be too much of a big deal if your cluster is remote.
And you're thinking of like a long-lived cluster?
Yes.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, my development workflow has definitely been more short-lived clusters. So if I'm developing something, I'll make a kind cluster, do my work, and then just get rid of everything.
Just for the sake of having like a clean slate when you start developing next.
Yeah, that's right.
That makes a lot of sense.
And I don't want my kind clusters don't last across computer restarts.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, so I think our team's next bit of homework certainly is to figure out how to speed up the kind load process, or at the very least give you some visibility into like, yes, we're still working, Tilt hasn't just frozen and abandoned you. I also wanted to know, as far as speed, that I noticed y'all have a live updates enabled, which is awesome. How do you feel about the speed of those? Is it appropriate? Is it still too slow? How often does Tilt say like, whoops, can't do a live update, I'm gonna do a full Docker build? What have been your experiences with that feature?
Once I got through making sure that I had all the paths set correctly and that live update was getting triggered, I would say it's great. We were accidentally using the -A flag for go build to rebuild all packages, so live update was taking about a minute, and then Nadir got rid of that, so now it's like 8 to 10 seconds on my laptop if I need to change something. So I would say it's great.
And we're doing something a little bit different than I think what the documentation says. So we're rebuilding the binary locally and then pushing the binary to the running image versus pushing our diff to the image and having it rebuild the binary on the Docker image.
Oh yeah, that's a great, because it keeps your images nice and light. That's
right, yeah, because I think there was something like 2 gigs or something.
Yeah, it was about 2 gigs to be able to do a build in the container.
Cool. Well, I'm glad that's working well for you. I didn't get a chance to look. Are you doing that with a local resource, or how are you doing that binary?
It's a local resource, yeah.
Cool.
Andrew, before we go on to another topic, Andrew, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Maya, I just wanted to say that it kind of echoes back to what Chuck was saying, so I think it's probably going to be more of a reiteration, but I'm part of a work stream team at VMware where I've got a couple of engineers, and they're new to CapV and other aspects of Kubernetes, and I find that kind is useful because it builds a habit, right? They have to learn how to deploy it over and over again. And that actually is useful for making sure they know how to work on the project versus, oh, here's this long-lived thing. And then what they're really learning is, okay, well, how do I interact with this long-lived thing? And maybe not the end-to-end workflow. So, I mean, maybe it's a limitation of resources that people don't like to use kind. But the other nice thing that we recently did with CapV, and this kind of relates back to kind, which is why I'm saying this, is and Tilt, is we used to always have to push images for pre-submit tests on Prowl because we would then run them somewhere else to test them. But with Kind, you don't have to push images at all, which is really nice for doing local tests. And it may not seem like a big deal, but it when you have large teams and that are decentralized and to be able to confine the test workflow that's repeatable, reproducible, and behaves the same everywhere, but also doesn't really need a bunch of remote resources to work, it's actually really useful. So that's why I like Kind. I mean, to me, Kind is like the single most useful thing that's come out of Kubernetes for developers ever. Tilt may be a close second. I'm getting used to it.
That's pretty exciting. Cool. That's really useful context and makes a lot of sense. Neat. Did folks have anything else to say either about Kind or about the speed of live update? Cool. I noticed that y'all are running non-Docker container runtime and are using a start.sh solution to restart your processes. Is that working okay? Just wanted to check in because it's been a point of confusion for some folks in the past.
As far as I know, yes. Chuck, you're the one who worked with the Tilt folks to get that put in for us, right?
Yeah, that's been working fine. We haven't had any problems there.
Cool.
I have sorry, I need to raise
Go ahead.
my hand. When you say non-Docker, is it Containerd?
Yep.
Okay, I wanted to add that maybe the reason that is because the machine images that we deploy with CAPI are all based on Containerd. So I think it's probably good that aligns with what we're actually encouraging people to do when they build their machine images. Maya, I don't know if you heard that.
Oh, yeah. No, that's
You're
all.
on mute.
Am I unmuted now?
Yeah.
Great. Cool. Let me just get back to my notes. Yeah, I'm not sure I had anything else, but Nick, is there anything you want to jump in with or Dan? Cool. Unless anyone has anything else to tell us or request about Tilt while you've got us on the line, we're super jazzed that you're liking developing with Tilt, and we're going to be working in the next couple weeks to speed up developing Cluster API with Tilt, because we think that addressing some of your pain points will be a good way to decide on things to focus on that will help other folks. That would just bubble out and help other folks using Tilt without us getting totally bogged down in the multitude of things we could be fixing about the product. So I guess, anyone have anything else for us?
Andrew, you again?
Sorry, yeah.
No, go for it.
It would be great to see some integration between y'all and ASCII Cinema, if you've ever seen that or work with that.
I'm vaguely familiar. Say more. What kind of integration are you thinking?
I mean, just built-in support for, built-in support for if I do a demonstration with Tilt, after the fact, I can say, oh, and I want the demo from that. I just want that part of Tilt could be enable ASCII Cinema. So at the end of everything, you've recorded everything.
Interesting.
There is a snapshot feature that kind of gives you all the logs of the existing environment in a shareable space, which is pretty cool. It's been pretty
I saw that. I think what and thank you. And I think what I meant was, well, ASCII Cinema also has here's how you upload it and here's the shareable link feature. So, well, I could take those logs and then share them. I don't know. I'm being lazy. If there was an easy, Tilt's an easy button in a lot of ways. So the more easiness you can add to that button, the bigger you can make that button, the better it is, right?
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Cool. Thanks for the feedback. All right, I think that's all we got.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for joining and bringing up Tilt. I think it's fantastic, and looking forward to seeing what else you can come up with.
Sounds like a plan. Thanks.
All right, does anybody have any other topics before we move on to backlog grooming issues that don't have milestones? Okay, let me switch over. As usual, I'm going to start on the bottom and work my way up. So we're going to look at the oldest ones first. I did add a comment to this one about not using load balancers in Alpha 3, and I had said I was going to add a comment, I don't know, 3 weeks ago, and it slipped my mind. So my recommendation here, if you're okay with it, Andrew, is just to close this, because I don't think there's anything that's going to stop us from continuing to support single machine control plane.
That's fine. And in fact, I put this in the notes of the doc, but just another, and give a shout out to Chuck. CAPV has implemented, I think we're the first ones outside of CAPD, the E2E framework that Chuck developed along with others. It's part of every pre-submit. And we are using HA for that, but we are doing a single node without any load balancers. So yeah, we'll know real quick if this stops working, because our E2E will break. But yeah, real big shout out to Chuck, because that works so well.
Cool, thank you. Okay, submit CAPI providers for a given release for CNCF conformance verification. Sounds like a great idea. I think this is probably something that can happen independent of milestone, like it just happens when it happens. Priority wise, I'm thinking important long-term for now, because getting V1 Alpha 3 done is more important in my book. And I'm gonna just put this in next, and we can, if anybody is interested in, I don't know if we're gonna try and automate doing some of this. I know you have to open up a pull request to one of the CNCF repos, so I don't know how much we'd automate, but if anybody has any thoughts, please feel free to jump on this issue with comments. So we have an awaiting more evidence about Cubadium and init not recognizing Docker installed via snap. I think this is a Cubadium issue, and the reporter never came back. So I'm going to close, and Andrew, go ahead.
Are we supporting Docker on the machine? We're not building them with Docker, but I'm curious, and are we supporting Docker with the machine images if people replace Containerd with Docker? And is that a question for CAPI, or is that some other? CAPI's kind of been the upstream discussion forum for the image builder anyway.
I honestly don't know the answer to that question.
Well, that I ask obviously because of this question, because this is Docker, not Containerd. So.
I would think that we, in theory, or I think support is a slippery word, because we're an open source set of projects, and so I think it's like, does it work with Docker versus Containerd versus something else? And it could work with Docker. It probably should work with Docker, given that Kubernetes works with Docker. So I think that it's kind of, it's hard to say. Like, if you can produce an image that can run Kubernetes correctly and it works with Docker, then I don't see why it wouldn't work in a cluster API setup, if you know what I mean. All right, is that cool, Andrew?
Yes, okay.
Yeah. Go cyclolint errors in main Go. I'm pretty sure with the split that Chuck recently did, where we now have multiple manager processes, that this generally went away. So basically this is something that if you have enough webhooks and enough controllers, and you're using KubeBuilder to generate your main.go, and it keeps adding all the setup with manager calls, you basically end up exceeding the Go Cyclo limitations for linting. And I think we we're generally saying, well, this is kind of generated code, so we can just go ahead and say, don't lint this for GoCyclo. I'm tempted just to close this unless anybody feels strongly that we need to fix it.
I can update the ticket if you assign it to me. I can just run this against the current main because it did change quite a bit with the manager split.
Okay, thanks, Chuck.
Which maybe I should have PSA'd at the beginning of this meeting, but totally didn't think about it.
Yeah, so in terms of that, you want to take a minute and just say why you did what you did?
Yeah. So we split apart the main cluster API manager into three different managers. There's the KubeADM Bootstrap manager, the KubeADM control plane manager, and then the core manager, which is the same as what you have now, or what it was before was all bundled into one manager, and now it's split into three managers, and we're able to ship 3 different images with 3 different sets of YAML, allowing you to not use the KubeADM components if you so choose, and use your own Bootstrap provider.
Thank you, Chuck. All right. Should the cluster API pod have a kube RBAC proxy sidecar like the KubeADM Bootstrapper does? I'm thinking probably yes. I don't remember, Chuck, when you were doing CabPK, did you put the sidecar in, or do you know where that came from?
I don't know where that came from. I've seen it. It was, if it's there, I'm guessing it was generated into place.
That's true. Different versions of Kube Builder I've used, like between point seem to get this weird code that shows up now and then, and I could tell it was just generated code. And at some point, CatV had the same thing. That or somebody copied a template from another project and somebody had put it there.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, the kubeauth proxy sidecar protects the metrics endpoints from anonymous access. All right, so I'm going to put help on this one and priority. I'm going to go with soon because it is a security related thing. I'm going to put it in the milestone for now. Alrighty, ClusterCuddle v2 support for additional backend implementations for provider repository. Fabrizio, are you familiar with this one?
Yeah, basically there is this person is asking to have a different backend, not only GitHub, which is something that is in a roadmap somehow, but it is proposing to do this using a library. I don't remember the name, so yeah.
All right, well, I'm assuming this was not anything that was in scope. I mean, basically what was in scope in the initial proposal was you can pull it from someplace like GitHub, or you can override the location of the YAML and whatnot with a config file that says go get it from some alternative place, right?
Yeah, in the initial proposal, we are going to support GitHub and local file system. So, and there are PR for both of them. The additional backend is, in my opinion, is out of this release.
Okay, so I put this in the backlog and it's in the next milestone. Thank you. KubeADM Bootstrap provider does not take into account the cluster API server port. I think I saw this over the break or when I got back, and there was some question about taking a look after the holidays. Andrew, go ahead. You're muted, Andrew.
So I say you can assign it to me if Chuck's busy. I literally just did this for CapV, but I don't know if it should be a standard thing. I'm using the port as like the vSphere cluster control plane endpoint port as a possible default. So you could define that, but not the host, and that would specify the port.
Well,
I actually think
this is specifically talking about cluster spec, cluster network API server port.
Oh, that one, not the control plane endpoint. Okay, sorry.
I'm going to put this in backlog. I don't think it's anything we need to change for right now, and we can look at it when people have time. Okay, next up, we need to move the machine deployment annotations to the right API group. We have help wanted and cleanup, and we need conversion logic. I think this, Vince, did you move them at all, or they're still old?
I didn't move them.
Okay. So I'm gonna do long-term on this, and we have help wanted on there, so that's good. Alrighty, define constraints for upgrades crossing cluster API versions. I know you and I talked about this, Fabrizio. Is this, without getting into too many details here, in terms of priority and milestone, is this something that needs to be solved for Alpha 3?
I guess so, because we will have in V1 Alpha 3 the first implementation of cluster cutoff upgrade. So we have to choose how to make this happen.
Okay, that's fair. And next one is also you, Fabrizio. Add label to provider components for easier cluster cuddle adoption.
Yeah, basically the idea is that I would like to cover the use case that an operator that has an existing management cluster want to start using a cluster cutoff. And for doing so, I'm suggesting that each provider adds a label in the next release that will be issued from now till V1 Alpha 3 gets out. And so basically when V1 Alpha 3 gets out, most likely all the existing cluster already have a label that make the adoption almost automatic.
Right, so this is just the provider components, like the deployments and RBAC and whatnot. This is not clusters and machines and everything.
Exactly, this is only for the provider components.
Seems reasonable to me. I mean, it's mostly just adjusting the customized YAML that we have, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Why don't we create individual issues for the various providers that you have listed here in the appropriate GitHub repositories, and make sure that it's clear to do it for the Alpha 2 and the master development work. So we'll have 2 different PRs for it for each one.
Okay.
And you can just link back to this one for all the other ones.
Okay, I will take care of open the issue.
Awesome. There we go. And implement a shared framework for creating test objects. Also Fabrizio. This looks like a long-term next.
Yeah, this is a follow-up of a comment on one PR. Basically, in one PR, I'm implementing a test framework that generates cluster object, cluster machines with all the relation, all the
right.
And this is now implemented mostly for testing move, cluster cutoff move, but JSON observed that this might be useful for some, also for in other place. So this is the issue tracking, that the idea.
Okay. Yeah, and I have some previous experience with other projects doing, like, basically creating a builder for individual things. So like in Bolero, we had a builder for backups and a builder for restores, and you could just say, like, I'd like a new builder with this namespace, this name, these characteristics, and at the very end you just say .build, and then it would give you back the object that you wanted. So we can maybe look at something like that. Okay. Control plane should scale up serially, not in parallel. And this is control plane. This is needs to come in, and it's in the milestone. And then bump concurrency of the Docker provider workers to 10. Oh, this already has a milestone. Thank you, Chuck. Okay, so we are done. I think there's not really any time for anything new. So Happy New Year, everybody. Thank you for joining today, and see you next time.